There is no reason to belabor a crucial point. When Raskolnikov comes back from having committed the murder, he becomes paranoid and is immediately taken with pangs of conscience. In sections 1 and 2 of Part 2, Raskolnikov wakes from a feverish doze, discovers bloodstains on his clothes. He is not taken off the loop where his axe has hung on his sleeve. The working of his conscience will proceed even as we learn more deeply about his motives for committing the murder. Instead of belaboring this, let us meet some of the characters that Raskolnikov visits, because through these characters we see other examples of suffering and other examples of loving. We see simple faith and evil. Raskolnikov is summoned to the police station because he has failed to pay his rent. There he meets a couple of very interesting policemen. In the second section, he goes and visits his old friend, Razhumikin. In section 5, he meets his sister's fiancé, Luzhin. We meet Marmeladov again and his family in section 7. Let us focus on these other characters and see how they respond to the human situation. Starting with his old friend, Razhumikin. Raskolnikov is wandering around town, feeling ill. He feels a boundless, almost physical loathing for everything he met or saw around him. An obstinate, spiteful, hate-filled loathing. All the people he meets are repulsive to him, their faces, their movements, their voices. He is on this side of the Great Divide, hating a world that still tolerates him, perhaps. And it is in this context that he goes and visits his friend, Razhumikin. Razhumikin, like Raskolnikov, came from a background of poverty. Razhumikin is doing some work as a translator, translating a book from the German on whether woman is or is not a human being. Sounds interesting. He asks Raskolnikov to join in and split his pay as translator, even fronting him some of the money. Raskolnikov looked bad, and perhaps he was down on his luck. A little work would do him good, or so Razhumikin thought. But Raskolnikov lays down his 3 rubles that Razhumikin has given him and walks out. This is on page 113. Raskolnikov wanders home in a sort of boundless horror of the world around him, and he falls on his sofa for days in a feverish condition, with moments of delirium and semi-awareness. This is how section 3 begins, and here we learn more about Razhumikin. Razhumikin was worried about Raskolnikov. Razhumikin brought a doctor, Zosimov. He was worried that Raskolnikov had some nervous nonsense or was suffering from poor rations after witnessing Raskolnikov's odd behavior in his apartment. Razhumikin's initial impression was right. Raskolnikov has brain fever. Brain fever for Dostoevsky always means some conflict between one's conscience and one's outer life. So Razhumikin is partly a man of insight, but he is also a student, and he traces Raskolnikov's brain fever back to poor rations or insufficient funds. He thinks that economic things can cure Raskolnikov's condition. All you need is some soup, some good soup, some raspberry preserves perhaps. This is Razhumikin's approach to solving Raskolnikov's brain fever. Perhaps Raskolnikov is just worried about not being able to make rent, and they are arranging it so he can. Money is coming from his family. Razhumikin is kind and concerned, but neither of them at this point can figure out why Raskolnikov is going crazy. Razhumikin asks if he, Raskolnikov, is afraid of some secret and talks about how Raskolnikov had been dreaming. Razhumikin is at first blush generous, warm, and concerned about his friend. In the face of genuine human suffering, he looks at it like a modern who thinks that the suffering is the result of circumstances. The young doctor, Zosimov, who has a special interest in psychiatric disorders, comes to see Raskolnikov in section 4. The doctor brings news that one of the house painters who had knocked at the door had been arrested for the crime. Nikolai. Nikolai had found some pawned jewels in an empty flat and sought to sell them. He is discovered in the possession of jewels stolen from the murdered pawnbroker. Razhumikin seems to think that Nikolai is innocent, though much physical evidence points toward his guilt. His reason for thinking Nikolai is innocent lies in psychology. It would not have been humanly possible, he says, for Nikolai to have killed 2 women with axes, and then a few minutes later engaged in light-hearted horseplay as he had done. Here Razhumikin shows that he is willing to go beyond social, political circumstances in order to understand things that the state of mind that people have rather than incriminating the material facts help to ascertain guilt. He applies modern ideas to Raskolnikov, but he applies conscience ideas to Nikolai. They are linked by his willingness to think well of people, to think that both are innocent. And this is just a way of showing that his soul is complicated. Razhumikin's mode of analysis is complicated. From psychological facts alone, one could show how to get on the right track, Razhumikin says to the doctor and Raskolnikov. We have the facts, they say, but the facts are not everything. At least half the game is knowing how to handle the facts. So says Razhumikin, and these are wise words. The panorama keeps visiting Raskolnikov. As if to highlight the contrast with Razhumikin, Section 5 contains a visit from Luzhin, the fiancé of Raskolnikov's sister. He is a self-made man. He has become a lawyer with high rank in the civil service. He is officious, pompous, and very self-important. He is delighted, as he says, to meet young people. One learns what is new from them, he says on page 147. All these new things of ours, reforms, ideas, all this has touched us in the provinces as well. But to see better, to see everything, one must be in Petersburg, where one finds a clearer vision. Here we have a modern man, a city man, a man of Petersburg. Kind of people of a certain set talk about like that in Washington, D.C. these days, where they think everything important happens. Luzhin is a progressive who sees useful new ideas have been spread and some useful new books instead of the former dreamy and romantic ones. Literature, he thinks, is acquiring a shade of greater maturity. Many harmful prejudices have been eradicated and divided. In short, we have cut ourselves off irrevocably from the past. He is talking about Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done, the ultimate Russian progressive book. Luzhin's is an effective Christianity, he thinks, without faith. He loves his neighbor, but he does so by loving himself before all others, because everything in the world is based on self-interest. He explains exactly the view of Chernyshevsky's hero. Luzhin has heard about the murder of the pawnbroker. How does he explain it? First, he notes that crime has been increasing not only among the lower classes, but among the upper classes in a parallel way. Students have intercepted mail. The rich have counterfeited banknotes. Lottery tickets have been forged. He suspects that some man of higher society has killed the pawnbroker because peasants do not pawn gold objects. Then Raskolnikov wakes up and enters into the conversation. The pawnbroker's murder, he says, went just according to Luzhin's theory. If everything is self-interest, then one can go around putting a knife in people, says Raskolnikov, if one can get away with it. So Raskolnikov had heard, and so Luzhin had argued. The fiancé answers with his general officiousness, suggesting that no economic idea is an invitation to murder. But the sick man, Raskolnikov, sees things better. One could murder if one could get away with it. And then he gets to his most important point, which is that a man who puts self-interest at the heart of his personal philosophy would always be a poor husband. Raskolnikov had been glad, Luzhin had been glad that Dunya had been poor, so he could take his wife up from destitution and be loved as a benefactor. It is not how he would treat her, but rather that he had lifted her that would make for the marriage. Luzhin is offended by this comment, but eventually Raskolnikov chases him and the others out of his apartment. So in these first two people of the human panorama, we see a confused Razhumikin, with his feet on each of the two stools, sometimes reducing human action to circumstances like poverty, while other times recognizing the importance of human psychology. And then we have Luzhin, a pretty consistent, despicable new man who reduces all human activity to self-interest. The friend had come to find and help Raskolnikov. The fiancé had come to make an announcement. The friend is human and lovable, while the fiancé is stiff and ugly. We are going to see more characters in this panorama, including our first prostitute, in the next video.